welcome tonight to the World Affairs Council. I'm very pleased that we have with us a colleague of mine, Niall Ferguson, who is with me at the Hoover Institution, or rather I should say I'm with him at the Hoover Institution, and despite the fact that we serve at the same institution, there is no collusion this evening. I want to point out that Niall has written this fantastic book. It is an introduction, I think, to the public at large in a well-written and accessible way on network science. He looks in a deep and profound way at how networks have not only affected our time currently, but really applies the lessons of network science to his specialty, which is history. And if you look at the title, the very last word of it has to do with Facebook, because he looks at social networks primarily as we look at as he looks at his historic analyses of how things have changed as a result of networks. He breaks the book up into hierarchies and networks, and we can talk a bit about that. But I think given the historic nature of today, this being Monday the 19th, the day when Facebook has lost 7% of its value, when Mark Zuckerberg is leaving the office with $5 billion less in his pocket, in shares, someone says. We'll take a look at what has gone on with Facebook and really how that relates to what you've been saying for quite a while about these social networks and the culture of the Silicon Valley. But let's start really to talk a bit about your book and the concept of social networks and how they're applied within power.
Well, Marcus, thanks. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. This is an organization that I have supported and been involved with for many years. Now that I'm a West Coast denizen, it's nice to be here more frequently. I wanted to write a book that would relate what happens in Silicon Valley to history, and also explain a little bit about network science to historians. I was very struck when I moved first to Stanford a year and a half ago by the indifference of most people in technology to history. For many of them, history seemed to have begun around about the time of the Google IPO, and everything before then was the Stone Age. And I was sort of reminded of the atmosphere that I'd encountered about 10 years before on Wall Street in New York City, when it was the investment bankers who thought that they were the masters of the universe, who had solved all the world's problems. And I thought, wow, these same attitudes appear to have been relocated to Silicon Valley. My sense was that a crisis was coming to Silicon Valley, like the crisis that had come to Wall Street 10 years ago. And this book, in many ways, is a little bit like The Ascent of Money, which came out just a few weeks before the failure of Lehman Brothers. And this book has come out, I think, just weeks before peak Facebook. I think we're living through peak Facebook. We're living through a major turning point in public attitudes towards online social networks and technology generally. And I hoped, as with The Ascent of Money, that by providing some historical perspective, I'd help people understand this moment better. So you alluded to the extraordinary story that has broken, or perhaps more accurately rebroken, since some of us knew a bit about it already, the story of Cambridge Analytica's role in the 2016 election. I have said on more than one occasion, and I suggested in the book, that Facebook was indispensable to Donald Trump's election. And most people used to look at me when I said this, and they would say, well, you're nuts because it was Twitter, or you're nuts because it was cable television, or you're nuts because Hillary Clinton was a terrible candidate. There are any number of explanations for what happened in 2016. But if you were looking closely, the really crucial tool that transformed not only the presidential election of 2016, but also the Brexit referendum, was Facebook advertising. And its use by the campaigns, Brexit and then Trump, I think was really crucial. Now we know a little bit more about why the Trump campaign was able to use Facebook advertising so effectively, and that is because it had data on 50 million Americans that had been acquired by Cambridge Analytica from a Cambridge University researcher who'd assembled it in Facebook terms legitimately, but then not legitimately made it available to Cambridge Analytica, who made it available to Steve Bannon, who made it available to Donald Trump. This is a really important piece in the jigsaw puzzle of what happened in 2016. And I think it's good that the New York Times has run this story, because prior to that, it had only really surfaced in places like the British newspaper The Guardian. And if you look in the book, I say there's something funny about Cambridge Analytica. We don't quite know what its role was in 2016. It had a role. Maybe it was exaggerating its own role. Well, the news that just came out this past weekend makes it a little bit clearer what that role was.
Right. So two things that I take from that. One is when your books come out, you should sell short on whatever the issue is that you've written about.
And I should too, because I'm really terrible at this kind of thing. I will kind of come up with an insight like this and then write a book instead of just going out there and making money. And it's why I'm an academic and not running a hedge fund, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, this would have definitely led you to take a skeptical view of Facebook, just as my ascent of money would have led you to short the investment banks. That would have been a great trade. I every morning wake up and kick myself for not having done that.
Well, so, and the second thing, of course, is that when we look at these social networks, and I think one of the insights that you bring to the book and to the reader is that we're actually in a second revolutionary period here. And so as we see the fluctuations of these technology companies, it really is in the context of a much larger context, which is a revolution akin to that of the invention of the printing press, of Gutenberg's press. So that while we may watch wild fluctuations of these technology companies and various things we'll have transparent insight into, perhaps you can create the context in which these are all operating and the effect that they're having, not merely on the 2016 election or on the Brexit election, but really in a much larger context, given that this is the World Affairs Council, on global affairs, not merely the nation state, but it is something that the nation state is what is affected to a great degree by these networks.
Well, Marcus, the book offers a framework for thinking about world history, which is essentially this. For most of history, human beings preferred relatively centralized hierarchical forms of organization. States are only one of these. There are many others. But there are a couple of periods in history when, partly for technological reasons, more decentralized, distributed networks were able to challenge established hierarchies. And this is roughly the framework within which the book operates. And the analogy that seems to work best is the one that you just alluded to, and that's the analogy with the impact of the printing press, in which, of course, is a 15th century invention in Europe, but it really starts to take on revolutionary power in the 16th century. In fact, it's exactly 501 years ago that Martin Luther starts his campaign to reform the Roman Catholic Church, a campaign that would have gone nowhere had it not been for the fact that by 1517, there's a printing press in pretty much every North European city of any consequence. So this analogy is quite a good one. It turns out that the effect of the printing press on the cost of a page is about the same as the invention of the personal computer. It has the same kind of impact in terms of the cost of communication, which is drastically reduced by about 99%. And it has a similar effect as the personal computer and the internet on the volume of communication, the volume of content that can be communicated. So there's a similarity in these two network revolutions. And that's not only a similarity in terms of the speed and cost of networking, it's a similarity in terms of the consequences. Mm-hmm. To avoid an excessively long answer to your question, let me just say this, that the real difference between the two periods is that our period has gone much faster, about 10 times faster. What took a century in the 16th and 17th centuries essentially unfolded in 10 years in our time. You can date our network era from perhaps the 1970s. But of course, it's really grown in scale and speed in the very recent past, in the past decade or so. What are the consequences of greatly increasing the capacity of humans to network, to connect with one another? You might think it would be good. And certainly since the mid-1990s, Silicon Valley kept telling us that if everybody were connected, then everything would be awesome. And as Californians, you'll have heard this a gazillion times. You hear it almost on a daily basis on NPR.
It's part of the religion
A
of the
planet
Silicon
where everything
Valley.
is connected. What could be better? And actually, that was what Martin Luther thought in his own way. He thought that if everybody could just be connected and be able to read the Bible in the original, in their own language, they would be able to have something like that priesthood of all believers that the Bible talks about. There was a similar kind of optimism about what the printing press would make possible. Guess what? It didn't turn out that way. What in fact happened was that a lot of people said to Martin Luther, we agree with you, but you don't go far enough. That's people like me from Northern Europe. And then the people from Southern Europe said, actually, you're a heretic. We're going to burn you and anybody who agrees with you. And for the next 130 years, Western Europe was plunged into religious conflict, some of it astonishingly bloody. Fast forward to our time, and what do we see? Online social networks, whether you look at Twitter or Facebook, are characterized by very high levels of polarization. If you graph the retweet patterns in the United States, it's essentially liberals retweeting liberals and conservatives retweeting conservatives. That polarization which occurred in the 16th century around religion has happened in our time around politics. And I'll make one last comparison. I don't think Luther expected crazy stuff to go viral, but it did. It wasn't just Luther's critique of the Roman Catholic Church, much of which was legitimate, that went viral. The idea that witches live amongst us also went viral. And it turns out that it was the places that most enthusiastically embraced the Protestant Reformation that burnt the most witches. Now, the notion of witchcraft is crazy. Today, it just belongs in Harry Potter books. But back then, it was taken as literal truth and led to a really horrific spate of violence. I think that the tendency for crazy stuff to go viral is one of the most striking features of our time. We tend to refer to it by the shorthand of fake news, but the more we look at this phenomenon, to the historian anyway, the more familiar it looks. So you network the world, you expect everything to be better, and lo and behold, you end up with polarization and crazy stuff going viral.
You mentioned religion and how it changed in that era, but of course religion is playing an important role in our contemporary era as well, because of these networks are also allowing for jihadism to spread its message of violence. We're seeing ISIS and other organizations leverage the power of these networks to, in fact, replicate their stories and propagate them around the world. How do you see, maybe you can draw those parallels as well, if you see those parallels?
Well, I do think that one of the striking features of our time is that the technology of the internet has in some ways been more disruptive of Islam than of Christianity. Of course, the radicalization of both Shia and Sunni Islam begins in the 1970s. Well, it begins earlier than that, but it really begins to kick off in around 1979. And in that framework, in that period, technology doesn't play much of a part. But by the time you get to Al-Qaeda's attack on the World Trade Center, and more recently the rise of Islamic State, then technology does come into play. I enjoyed writing those parts of the book. Maybe enjoyed is not the right word, because this is a subject which is deeply troubling. But it's very interesting to see the network of the 9/11 plotters graphed, as it was by a rather enterprising network scientist, Valdis Krebs, and then to compare it with the much, much larger network that Islamic State has created online. And the fascinating thing about Islamic State is that it is primarily a network. It's not been a successful state. It's pretty much failed as a state in Iraq and Syria. But it's successful online, and I don't think it's been defeated online at all. If anything, it's continuing to to grow online. So it's possible, I think, using this framework of distributed networks and hierarchical structures to have take a new look at a lot of issues that are discussed in this forum regularly, including Islamic extremism. My wife, who's much more interesting than me, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, published a book, a Hoover book, last year on Dawah, the spread of non-violent extremism. Her point being that you don't really get to violent extremism until there's a network of non-violent extremism, of radical preaching. And that network is really fascinating to study. It's now a global network, it's very well resourced, and it continues to spread messages of literal interpretation of the Quran all over the world, with ultimately, I think, very dangerous consequences, because once people have imbibed that message, they're much more likely to be turned from extremists to terrorists.
Right. So let's look at other networks. One of the, you've spent a fair amount of time with Henry Kissinger and have written, in fact, are writing still about his work and his global understanding of order. And but really, you're looking at him, at least in the first volume, as an idealist and how he's looked at the world. But you also mentioned in this book that he introduced you in many ways to the concept of networks, and that his personal network, his political network, his financial network really opened your eyes to the power of networks. Could you talk a little bit about Henry Kissinger, and then we'll talk a little bit about his frame of how he sees world order, and maybe we can do a run around the world.
Well, I'm playing hooky, really, writing this book, because I'm in the midst of, halfway through writing a biography of Kissinger. And I got to the end of volume 1 a few years ago and realized that I wasn't ready to write volume 2. Volume 1's a kind of intellectual history of a refugee who becomes a soldier, who becomes a scholar, who becomes a public intellectual, and who enters only very partially the realm of power. And that's the story 23 to 1968. And I subtitled The Idealist partly to provoke, but also to make the point that if you read Kissinger's work from that time, it's not at all the realist that you're led to expect. In fact, he was very clearly an idealist relative to the people who were the realists in that period. I was left with a puzzle at the end of volume 1, and that was, how did this Harvard professor, whom nobody really saw as a powerful figure at the outset of the Nixon administration, become clearly the dominant figure by 1973, and in effect, the man in charge as Nixon descended into the death spiral of Watergate? Now, there are various possible answers to that question, but none of them seemed quite satisfactory. And then I had one of those flashes of insight. I thought, well, could it be not just force of will or intellectual firepower, but that Kissinger understood the transition that was happening from a relatively hierarchical world, the world of World War II and the early Cold War, when big, well-organized states compete with one another, mobilizing millions of people, to a world that was more decentralized, in which interdependence, to use a word he was very fond of then, took over from polar conflicts. And the insight that he had built a network, a very unusual network, very quickly, extending outside the government, into the media, as far afield as Hollywood, then all the way around the world to all the key states with which the United States was in negotiations. That insight seemed potentially very powerful. But then I thought, oh dear, I don't really know nearly enough about networks to write this. I've been talking about networks in my career since my early years. I mean, I wrote about financial networks in the Rothschild book and the Warburg book. I wrote about networks of nasty Scotsmen in the book on the British Empire. But I'd never formally studied network science. And maybe it was the prospect of moving to Stanford that brought this to my attention. But I had been very casual in my use of this terminology. So I thought, before I can really write volume 2 of Kissinger, I need to get a handle on this network business. And I need to stop being so sort of casual in my use of the term. So that was what led me to embark on this book, a sense that I needed to understand this better. I needed to learn, for example, some of the skills of social network analysis so that I could literally graph Henry Kissinger's network. And this book includes a first stab at that, a first attempt to understand the structure of politics in the Nixon and Ford years, to try to prove, which I think I'm able to, that by 1973, certainly, he'd become the central node in American politics. And that one could formally show that by graphing the network and identifying who had the highest betweenness centrality. I love all this jargon, but it's actually quite useful jargon when you're trying to establish who's really powerful in any given social network. So that was the reason that I got into network science and started reading voraciously. By the way, the great thing about this field is that it is so heterogeneous. I mean, you have people from all kinds of different disciplines who offer insight into how networks operate, ranging from sociologists to neuroscientists. I'll give a shout out to one of the geniuses I discovered in researching this book, Laszlo Barabasi, extraordinary man who works on networks really with a physics background. And reading his book, Linked, was a great moment of revelation for me. I started to understand much better what I was grappling with.
Well, it's a great shout out for Laszlo, who is a colleague of mine at Central European University, and he has written really a spectacular book in Linked. If you want to learn about Romania, Transylvania, and some of the events of that region, while also overlaying it with some of his scientific interests, I think it's something that really is worth your time.
Hungary plays a big part in this story. In fact, Central Europe more generally. The idea of 6 degrees of separation originates in a Hungarian short story from nearly a century ago. And it's often because of the mathematical dimension to this. It's often been Hungarian mathematicians who've propelled network science forward. He's the heir to a great Hungarian tradition.
People like Paul Erdős, who if anyone in here is a mathematician, if you ever meet another mathematician, you will ask, what is your Erdős number if you have one? And that will signify if the person you've written a paper with is how many degrees from the original Erdős who has written it. So you're a 1 if you wrote a paper with Paul Erdős. Yes. You're a 2 if you wrote a paper with the person who wrote a paper with Paul Erdős. So, and then so on. So your Erdős number is very important in mathematics.
It's like the 6 degrees of Monica Lewinsky, only for highbrows.
Yes, that's right. And Kevin Bacon doesn't play into this particular
6 degrees
game.
of Paul Erdős. I think that's absolutely spot on.
Yes. So let's, it's been an eventful period this weekend, and as I say, we're here Monday the 19th recording this. So this weekend we had, would you call it an election of President Putin? A re-election of President Putin? How would you characterize the Putin ascension or re-ascension?
Well, one always speaks extremely carefully on the subject of President Putin for fear of being poisoned. And I don't really say that entirely facetiously. Those of us who've been critical of Putin for years, and I think I wrote an article 10 years ago in Newsweek comparing him to Al Pacino's character in The Godfather, Michael Corleone. I wonder whether I should really go to London, much less to Moscow, with that kind of a track record. This is a very interesting time because hierarchical structures of governance are in some ways being reconstituted rather against the odds. Because if you go back to, I suppose, 2011-12, go back to the time of the revolutions in North Africa and the Middle East, people like Jared Cohen and Eric Schmidt were arguing that the technology was going to empower democratic forces and weaken tyrants. And I think a lot of people were attracted to that idea, and it seemed to sort of play out in Tahrir Square and elsewhere. Instead, what we see is that at least some authoritarian regimes figured out how to control the technology in order to consolidate their power. Putin is certainly one of these. Not only did Putin understand how to use the Russian internet as well as Russian television to consolidate his power, he has also understood how to use technology to disrupt the biggest threats to his position, which are, of course, successful Western democracies. And this is, I think, a very interesting development, that one of the great powers, and I think we can still consider Russia a great power, is also a rogue regime, at least in cyberspace. One could, I think, include in this reflection the even more impressive way in which the Chinese Communist Party has harnessed network platforms that are now as big as the big American tech companies to consolidate Xi Jinping's power.
These are Weibo and some of the other platforms that we
So yes, the Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent trio, the BAT companies, are the only real rivals to the big technology companies of Silicon Valley. There are no comparable European companies, much less Latin American or anywhere else. These are the only companies that are comparable in scale to the American tech companies. The difference is that they are very clearly hand in glove with the Chinese authorities. And if Xi Jinping's people say, we'd like some data on citizen X, it's not like Alibaba is going to say no. So I think we are seeing emerging in this time alternative models for the relationship between power, the hierarchy, or the tower in my title, and the square of social networks. In China, there's an almost symbiotic relationship now between the government or the Communist Party and the big tech companies. Russia's a slightly different case because, as I say, the Russians are, in some measure, the rogue regime in cyberspace. And I think the big question that we should all be pondering at this time is, do they really have a superior model? Are they going to have the last laugh? At this moment, it's certainly tempting to think that a new authoritarianism 2.0 or even totalitarianism 2.0 is establishing itself. Meanwhile, we're all assailed with anxiety about the state of our democracy. And I think this brings us back really to the question of what happened in 2016. This is the big question. Did these technologies that evolved in California primarily ultimately turn out to be a bigger threat to democracy than to dictators? If that's the case, then we were all very wrong less than 10 years ago.
You know, and you talk about the means by which these technologies have actually been turned on their head so they can be controlling technologies. They obviously have the ability to collect psychographic data and be able to affect elections. We see there are also great surveillance mechanisms. You mentioned China, to the point where you can actually use face recognition and identify individuals in the western part of the country while they're on the street and be able to make sure that you can control their movement. We see the Great Firewall as being very effective. So it seems to me the question then becomes, to what degree will these non-Western institutions, not the FANGs, the Facebook and Amazon, Netflix, Google, and you have a chapter, I think, titled such, FANG and BAT and the EU. Yeah. How will that competition really develop? Will these technologies and their authoritarian-oriented capabilities and applications outweigh and overtake what were originally the techno-utopian concepts of these free, open, independent networks?
Well, I think that there are 2 points to make, Marcus. Firstly, the internet was supposed to be a distributed, decentralized network. And if you talk to someone like Tim Berners-Lee, architect of the World Wide Web, he would say that ideal has been perverted by the emergence of giant network platforms that are quasi-monopolies in different domains. Amazon in the case of e-commerce, Google in search, Facebook and social networks. That was not how it was supposed to be. But with that centralization, with the emergence of these great aggregating platforms, possibilities have been created that didn't exist before. That 50 million citizens' data could be simply acquired and put to political as well as commercial use is a very shocking outcome. And I don't think one that anybody in the 1990s would have foreseen, when it still seemed possible for the internet to be a decentralized, distributed network. So I think the existence of the quasi-monopolies in the United States and in China has created a fundamental problem of governance. And we haven't solved that problem. The Chinese have solved it. And they've solved it in a distinctly Chinese way. The emperor rules. And if the emperor commands, then Jack Ma obeys. But we haven't really figured out any kind of a solution. What we've allowed to happen is that our public sphere, where our democracy debates and discusses the topics of the day, is now largely owned by a handful of companies. Here's a statistic that isn't in the book. I only found it out the other day. 80% of Americans now consume news that has been referred to them by either Google or Facebook. So people come to their news indirectly through these platforms, which means that the algorithms that decide what appears in your news feed or what appears in your search results are the most powerful editors in history. They determine the content that you see. And these algorithms have certain curious features, the most obvious of which is that they tend to give you more of what you already engaged with before. And not only more of the same, but a sort of more extreme version of what you already engaged with before. So that's point number one. That was certainly not the way that Tim Berners-Lee thought the internet would evolve. Point number two is there is now a global struggle, which is geopolitical in its nature, between the American tech companies and the Chinese tech companies. And if you'd asked me at the time I finished this book, who will win in the rest of the world, I would probably have said, well, I think the American companies will prevail, because they seem to be prevailing in Europe, and I thought the Chinese companies would essentially own China. I have revised that view, partly on the basis of a visit to Hangzhou, which is the headquarters town of Alibaba, and meetings with people at that company. I think the Chinese tech companies have a better story to tell than their American rivals when they go to other Asian countries, and not only other Asian countries, when they go to Latin American countries. And that story is, we can empower you because we understand emerging markets, and they don't understand emerging markets in Silicon Valley. What's the biggest difference between the Chinese tech companies and the American tech companies? I'll tell you, payments. The extent to which the Chinese have solved the payments problem is astonishing. If you go to China, you'll see that everybody pays with practically everything using their phone. It's either Alipay or WeChat Pay. They've achieved what PayPal couldn't do, displace conventional modes of payment. We're still messing around with credit cards, typing in our credit card numbers on websites. The Chinese think that's hilarious. They can't believe that we still pay for stuff with little plastic rectangles. So that's important, because if you are trying to sell your platform in India or Indonesia, what you really want to offer is a hugely powerful engine for small business, and that's what they do. So I think it's going to be fascinating over the next few years to see who wins the battle for the rest of the world, but increasingly my money is on China. Now, think of what that means politically. If their network platforms dominate in the rest of the world, that gives the Chinese government a very significant advantage. It means that the data can be aggregated not just from China, it can be aggregated for everywhere where Alibaba becomes dominant. I think many people on the West Coast, and I hear this all the time, say they get the Chinese challenge, but they don't really get it. They don't see that it actually is a very, very major competition that has now emerged in China. And I think that has big geopolitical consequences.
Right, and so the reaction from Washington, D.C. is suddenly, let's not let them have some of the latest technologies. Let's not let them be able to develop these platforms or these technological infrastructure, because we won't let them buy Qualcomm, for instance.
Right, and I think this is part of the trade war story that is so central to year 2 of Trump. It's not just a trade war about Chinese exports, it is also about Chinese investment, and what Chinese investment is going to be allowed by CFIUS, by the US committee that decides on these things, but also what investment the Chinese themselves are going to do, because they too have the power to not invest in US assets. This too becomes a strategic question of really some magnitude, considering that we still have what I once called Chimerica, the situation in which the Chinese finance the US fiscal and current account deficits, at least to some extent, with reserve accumulation. So this is all extraordinarily interesting from the vantage point of great power politics. A big question which has been doing the rounds for a while is, where do we go from here? Do we go into Graham Allison's Thucydides trap, where the incumbent power, the United States, inexorably finds itself in conflict with the rising power, China? There are plenty of examples in history of that happening, though it doesn't always happen. Or, and I sketch this alternative model in the final chapters of the book, do the great powers recognize at some point their common interests against small powers acquiring nuclear weapons, their common interests in dealing with problems like climate change? Do they come together in the way that the great powers came together at the end of the Napoleonic Wars and say, well, we're now going to run the show? That possibility, I think, existed perhaps momentarily at the end of 2016, but it's drifting away, partly because of the impossible situation between the United States and Russia created by Russia's intervention in the election. But I think also because from a Chinese vantage point, it's not necessary. It may be possible from China's vantage point just to go for it, gambling on mistakes by the United States, which increasingly create an opportunity for China to take global leadership over. So that seems to me like the big question for the next few years. Is there going to be Graham Allison's collision, or will there be some kind of great power condominium that avoids that? And I don't think it's possible to say for sure at this point.
Well, raising the question is certainly key. It's something that's on, I think, everyone's mind. There's been an assumption early on in this administration that certainly the Trump administration would find some accommodation with the Russians, being able to then figure out a way to either contain the Chinese juggernaut. I think that was one of the early expectations of the president's advisor, Steve Bannon, to look at how this Western Christian coalition could be created. I think you're right with the 2016 events, and now with some of these revelations of what the Russians actually did in 2016, that's become less likely. But what about then if you look at the ability of the Saudis to finance where the Chinese haven't been able to? We see that the new leadership that's arising in Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS.
Coming to town.
He's coming to town and to a technology company near you, perhaps to buy that technology company, or at least that entertainment company near you. Is there a realignment that we can see in the world that would then allow for this shift in power and not bring us into this conflict?
Well, there's a couple of things that spring to mind in that context. The first is the extreme difficulty Mohammed bin Salman faces as crown prince, and if he succeeds as king anytime soon, he'll face it still. Can you really bring the Saudi kingdom into the 21st century? Can you make all the different reforms that he is attempting that challenge the royal family's sinecures, the rents that they collect from a highly inefficient public sector, that challenges the power of the clergy, the Wahhabist clergy, to police Saudi society? Can you wean the economy off oil and try to diversify? Can you do all those things and remain alive? And I think there are good reasons to doubt that. It's an incredibly difficult thing to reform a good regime. To reform a bad regime is often the most difficult thing in history. And Tocqueville famously said the worst time for a bad regime is precisely when it tries to reform itself. Perhaps he's Lee Kuan Yew, or perhaps he's Gorbachev. I think that, again, it's too early to tell. I'm very struck by how ambitious he is being. He is certainly going further than I would have anticipated on women's rights. Though, as Ayan pointed out in a piece the other day in the Wall Street Journal, there's a long way to go. Driving is all very well, but if women still are required to have guardians at any age that determine their basic freedom of movement, then it's not really worth that much. So my sense is that and this is the second point, that there's a logic of a sort to American foreign policy in the region that was somewhat lacking before. I never really thought it made sense to do what Obama did, which was to bet that you could get a better relationship with Iran while at the same time alienating your traditional allies in the region. And you'll probably remember one of the last big interviews that he gave as president, Obama's interview with The Atlantic, which was astonishing because I think he insulted almost every traditional ally of the United States in the course of that interview, while at the same time claiming that Syria was his greatest achievement. It's lucky we do have term limits in this country, because when you start believing that stuff, it's definitely time to go start a library in Chicago. I think that's much more logical to regard Iran as the revolutionary power in the region that is causing disruption from Lebanon to Yemen, and to assemble a coalition of allies that extends all the way from Saudi Arabia via Egypt to Israel. And geopolitically, that looks a lot more logical. The problem is, it's quite a fragile coalition, that. And almost as soon as President Trump had visited the region, you had the blow up within the Gulf countries that remains unresolved. So I think one has to see this region as a place that is unlikely to stabilize anytime soon. Or to put it differently, the tension between the new networks that we've been talking about and the old hierarchies in the Gulf is a very large one indeed. And I'm not myself convinced that there is really a way of fixing Saudi Arabia. I have to say, I'll be truly amazed if he pulls it off.
Alive. Yes,
Right.
and survives. As Henry Kissinger broke up his global order and talked about the Chinese vision of what global order will look like. There's the American vision. There's the Islamist vision, the vision of Islam. And then finally, the place where you have your accent from, which is the European realm. Maybe we can talk a little bit about, it would have been 15 years ago.
We're stopping being European, as you may have
heard. I heard. Although I hear the Scots are not exactly happy about that. So
yes, true.
But had this been a World Affairs Council meeting, say, 10 years ago, even 15 years ago, we would have probably spent an awful lot of time talking about Europe. This is no longer the case in San Francisco. We sit on the edge of the Pacific Rim. Invariably, we'll talk about China, perhaps Latin America. Europe is an afterthought in many of our discussions today. But it still is key. It's key in figuring out what we're going to do with our relationship to Russia. It is still a dominant player in the production of global goods and services. And yet we see this area, this region in crisis. You've written a fair amount about this, and you do have a fair amount of familiarity with the region. Maybe you can give us a little bit of an overview of where Europe is and what's likely to occur there.
Well, I guess the main reason why you don't hear much talk of Europe in this part of the world is that Europe is a failure in the realm of technology. It's remarkable that none of the really big technology companies in the world are European. And future historians will ask, what went wrong with European technology? Did they lack the brain power? Well, no. Did they lack good universities? I can assure you there are some pretty good universities in Europe. But somehow none of the companies that were born in Silicon Fen, as they like to call Cambridge, England, got anywhere close to the scale of the big US companies, the big Chinese companies. And European integration, whatever it achieved, and it certainly achieved many things in terms of creating a large single market, did not create a market dynamic and competitive enough to produce really big breakthroughs in technology. And that's one reason that we talk less about Europe. We'll talk a lot more about Europe in San Francisco when the fines start hitting the US companies, which they've begun to do. The first really big fine was slapped on Google last year, but there's more in the pipeline. The European Commission has essentially decided that it's going to tax US tech companies, and then it's going to fine US tech companies, and then it's going to take away the data from US tech companies. I mean, the data portability rule is going to come in May. The fines for failing to carry out government policies on hate speech could kick in any time. I think Europe is going to start being a major headache for US tech companies. And you can see that this is a logical response to having no big tech companies of your own. So I think that's the first observation. The second observation I'd make is that Americans tend to think things are going worse in Europe than they really are. There's a curious kind of wishful thinking here, or maybe wishful non-thinking, as Sigmund Warburg would have called it. There's a kind of vague desire to see the whole thing fall apart. It's a bit like the American conviction that there'll be a massive economic crisis in China. Now, I know people who have predicted 10 of the last no economic crises in China, and there's a similar thing with the Eurozone crisis. Americans miss the Eurozone crisis. I mean, I have friends in New York who would like nothing better than another exit. I mean, they just couldn't get enough of Grexit. There was disappointment when that didn't happen. So would there be Nexit or Frexit? And on it went, and none of it happened. The only thing that happened was that Britain left the European Union. It didn't leave the single currency because it never was in the single currency. But there's still this hope that it'll all start up again because it was such fun, wasn't it? If only Italy could have a bad enough election result that we could all go short Italian assets. I mean, it was a pretty bad election result. You've got the Five-Star Movement winning a bigger chunk of the vote than people expected, and the Northern League winning a bigger chunk. But the populists in Italy can't easily form a government since those two parties don't agree on anything. And so I have a sense that Americans tend to exaggerate Europe's problems and underestimate what's going well. Actually, the European economies are well out of the crisis. Growth is strong. In Macron, the French have found a centrist who's also popular, who seems capable of delivering reforms. I was skeptical. He's proved me wrong. So I think the truth is that we're slightly underestimating Europe's ability to hurt American technology companies. That we're soon going to find out all about. And we're probably underestimating Europe's ability as an economy and as a confederation to stabilize and come out of the crisis that it went through.
Well, that's fascinating, and we'll see what happens in the next year, especially with the German coalition government that's just been formed, with the rise of some of these illiberal states, such as Hungary, and what we're seeing currently in Poland. But absolutely, perhaps next year we'll have another.
Well, I can give you one consoling bit of pessimism.
Yes, please.
I mean, I think on the migration issue, the Europeans do not have an easy solution in prospect. The flows were diminished after the great surge of 2015-16 when Angela Merkel opened the gates of Germany, but they have not stopped altogether. And if you look at projections of movement of peoples from, say, sub-Saharan Africa, it's pretty daunting from a European vantage point. It may be that we ain't seen nothing yet in terms of mass migrations across the Mediterranean, and I think it's going to be very difficult indeed for the Europeans to integrate even those people who came in the last couple of years. The North European economies do not have a good record of giving employment to people who come as asylum seekers or even as economic migrants. The US and the UK are much better at this. Northern Europe is really quite dreadful at it, but that's where most people have ended up, in Germany and Sweden and other countries in Northern Europe. And then there is the problem of the fundamental cultural assimilation, which is proving extremely difficult. So I think that's the big European problem. If you go to Europe, and I frequently do, the conversation has shifted from a conversation about the single currency, the monetary union, can we reform it, to a conversation about migration. And if you go to Berlin and you talk to the next generation of German politicians who will ultimately succeed Angela Merkel, although I think term limits may have been abolished in Germany too, without anybody quite noticing, but at some point Angela Merkel will step aside. That new generation of politicians is talking about European integration in terms of border security. And one of the striking changes in European politics, which I think is again underestimated here, is the extent to which Europeans have moved right on immigration, not only in Poland and Hungary, but right across the board. I mean, the poll that really most startled me from Europe last year was the poll that showed that very substantial proportions of European voters agreed with Donald Trump's policies on immigration. This is not the Europe that Americans like to imagine, which is, you know, London and Florence and then home. It's a Europe in which there's an increasing popular sentiment that the migration problem has not been addressed by the political centre, and that's what's keeping the populist fires burning, especially on the right.
Well, and if they are not going to be coming over the Mediterranean, then certainly the front door or to that is Turkey. And Turkey will control those flows one way or the other.
It does at this point control them. It's in many ways up to Mr. Erdogan just how many people can cross the Adriatic into the EU.
So that problem is one that we'll be watching as well.
Absolutely.
I think the only part of the world we haven't touched on, then we'll be able to, I've been going through some of the questions here and assimilating them into what we've been discussing, but the one part of the world that we really haven't touched on is what's south of us and what's south of Europe. So the African and Latin American regions, we've got a few minutes before we close this off, but maybe in the context of the relationship to both the United States and China. China has great interests in Africa, and they're reaching out to Latin America with these One Belt, One Road efforts. The United States seems to be entirely dismissive of both those regions. Certainly in Africa, we sent our former Secretary of State and abandoned him there before firing him. Latin America, well, it sort of ends at the wall. Maybe you can look at these two regions and summarize what we should see in the future here.
Well, I think a good deal about what is going on in Africa. Demographically, that is where a very large part of the population growth is going to come from in the coming 50 plus years. Technologically, Africa has been a surprising story of technological leapfrog, where cell phones have allowed parts of the country with very limited infrastructure quickly to catch up. And I think that's one of the most encouraging developments. One sees this very strikingly in places like Kenya. So if you think about it, the problem in Africa is it's essentially a race between demographics and technology. And the question really is going to be whether technology can allow African economies to become sufficiently rapidly growing to absorb the growing population, or whether ultimately the economic structures will fail, at which point the mass migration story starts to get really scary. And we can see when we look around the African continent, tremendous variation in performance, nearly always related to institutional quality. The story in South America is, of course, quite different because the level of development is much higher. There, I think the interesting story is the populism experiment has been run more often in that part of the world than anywhere else. And anybody from Latin America knows that they've tried it all ways. You know, the populism of the right, the populism of the left, and the crucial issue is nearly always, do the populists get to the point where they can change the constitution? And if they do that, you're really done for. That's what happened in Venezuela. It was avoided in Argentina, and those countries are now experiencing completely different economic and social outcomes. I think anybody interested in the politics of populism should watch closely the Mexican election, the Brazilian election, Colombian election, big elections in Latin America this year. I'm very struck, and I've spent more time in Brazil than in the other two, by how much that Brazilian election is starting to look like our 2016 election, where social media are playing a very big part, and a populist of the right, a man named Bolsonaro, is doing extremely well, partly, I think, because his social media numbers are so strong. And his message, which is a law and order message, which shades into justification for military rule in the past, is one that makes Donald Trump seem positively liberal at times. So watch closely what happens in that election. If Lula makes a comeback somehow against the legal odds, then it will be back to the future. But if you suddenly see this man Bolsonaro pulling ahead, that will radically change the direction for Brazil.
Well, I think we've done a full sweep across the
we
world.
We didn't do Antarctica, but
well,
I think there isn't time.
Anytime you're ready, and we haven't touched the Antipodean region as well, but they're being taken over by the Chinese at this point as well. Isn't that the case?
What was it? An Australian once said to me that I'd exaggerated Australia's independence from Asian developments. I should regard it as a semi-autonomous republic of the People's Republic of China. I think that's putting it too strongly, but I think that's another fascinating phenomenon of our time, the gradual coming to terms in Australia and New Zealand with their Asian status, with their being inseparable from what's going on in Northern Hemisphere Asia.
That's right. I mean, they're looking at their student populations in Australia. They're looking at the effects on politics in Australia. There are apparently electoral laws that allow for funding of candidates and for candidates who have come originally from the PRC who are now in Parliament. So it's an interesting region to watch, and we'll see how that develops as well.
You really took the world affairs
I
billing
did. You
literally.
see circle and
I
yes.
think this is a real global tour we've gone on.
You know, Neil, you've been talking about your book every week, and it seems that I thought, well, here we are. Of course, we've touched on networks. We should continue to look at networks, and certainly everyone here and those who are listening should buy your book and read it, because you will learn a great deal about networks and how they work historically and how they've affected some of the events that we're all familiar with, but we'll look at it in a very different way. But yes, this was an opportunity to, I think, take advantage of your experience and your knowledge and your exposure to some of the foreign policy greats who have had an effect on how our foreign policy in the United States has evolved. I want to toss it to you for a final sort of roundup so you can try to now synthesize everything we've discussed this evening before we then close off the radio portion of the evening.
You're asking for the unified
That's
field
right.
theory.
That's right. Well, we know
history.
now that we've lost a great cosmologist, I'm now looking for your.
If you ever do browse online for what is published in distant places such as Boston or London, I can't help plugging my most recent column, which was a tribute to Stephen Hawking, entitled A Brief History of Trump. And I set out to use as many of Stephen Hawking's own words from A Brief History of Time as I possibly could, tweaking it minimally to apply it to our own political predicament. And I'm extremely proud of this piece, not least because as the son of a physicist and the brother of a physicist, I just wanted to prove to them that I'd read the damn book. The Square and the Tower is not in the same league as A Brief History of Time, but it does, I think, provide a useful framework for thinking about the kind of issues that we've been discussing. It doesn't really matter where you go in the world. You will see an encounter, sometimes a collision and sometimes a fusion between the square and the tower. And I start the book really with a scene from pre-Renaissance Italy. That square and tower are the square and tower in the town of Siena. My argument is that wherever you look in the realm of power throughout history, there is some kind of tension between hierarchical structures of authority and distributed social networks. And we all live that tension in our own lives. You might find yourself in an org chart at work, but as soon as you step out the office, you're in a complex series of social networks. This is a powerful framework for understanding the problems that we confront. And the reason we were able to have this global conversation that felt like a sort of whistle-stop tour of the world is that the framework applies to pretty much everywhere, from the United States to China. Let me conclude with one quotation. After I published the book, Jack Ma gave a talk, I think it was last October, at a Communist Party conference. And he said that big data was going to solve the problem of social order because thanks to big data, quote, the bad guy won't even be able to enter the square. And I thought it was very revealing that he used the square to make that point. As you all know, in China, the square has a certain significance. There's only really one square that people are referring to, and that's Tiananmen Square. If I've learned anything from writing this book, it is that there is a possibility for authoritarian regimes to use the technologies that evolved originally in this most libertarian part of the world to their own nefarious ends. And although I hate to end on a chilling note, that may turn out to be the real bottom line of the square and the tower. At least in China, the tower has taken over the square.
Niall Ferguson, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for answering the questions
very
here.
much.
This brings us to the end of the radio portion.